Hello everybody, welcome back. This is your third sample question on the topic of residency requirements. So I hope by now you're starting to see that this is a very important topic in terms of studying for your ICCRC Full Skills Exam, and it can present itself in the exam in quite a variety of ways. This question here is going to be a little bit more difficult than the first two that we saw. So the first question we saw dealt with time requirements and how to add those up, what counts, what doesn't count. The second question we saw dealt with procedures in addition to those time requirements, and this one is going to tie everything together. So this one is going to really focus on those time requirements, so what counts towards residency and what doesn't count towards residency. And we'll take a look at all the little exceptions, all the little tricks, and by the end of this you're going to feel 1,000,000% prepared for the exam in this little specific area. All right, so enjoy the question, and I'll look forward to talking to you in your next lesson. All right, so I'm going to give you just a little warning here that this question is pretty difficult. So stay calm, we're going to get through it together, and after this, you're going to breathe a sigh of relief because you survived probably one of the most difficult questions we've ever done in these videos. And here is your question. So I know you're looking at it and it looks pretty big. Well, this is a difficult question, but we're going to work through it together and we'll get to the correct answer together as well. All right, I'll read it out to you in case you are driving or just listening to this. So we have Marissa. Now Marissa arrived in Canada on October 30th, 2013 as a permanent resident under the Saskatchewan Health Professions stream and stayed from October 30th, 2013 to March 23rd, 2014. She then went back to Mexico to complete her PhD, but returned to Canada at the beginning of December 2014. She was fortunate enough to be offered a job at the Saskatoon General Hospital and worked there from December 2014 to July 2015. During this time, she was sent to the Congo for 3 months to oversee a vaccination process organized as part of Canada's disaster relief program to eradicate polio. Upon returning to Canada in June 2015, she married Domingo, a permanent resident from Uruguay, and from July 2015 to December 2015, she accompanied him to his country because he needed to help run his family's restaurant in Uruguay during this time. After this, Marissa spent a year in Mexico while Domingo returned to Canada, though Domingo visited her in Mexico when he could. It is now January 1st, 2017, and Marissa calls Maurice, an RCIC, because Domingo has been offered an employment contract with Urucan, which is an import-export company. The company is owned by 3 Uruguayans and 2 Canadians, and they would like Domingo to work mainly in their office in Uruguay to make sure that the shipments leaving Uruguay meet the Canadian standards. Marissa would like to accompany Domingo to live in Uruguay, but wants to make sure that she will not be in violation of her residency requirements. What is Maurice likely to advise? Now we have A. Marissa will not meet her residency requirements if she accompanies Domingo to Uruguay. We have B. Due to the fact that Marissa is married to a permanent resident, if Domingo meets his residency requirements, Marissa is exempt from this requirement. We have C. Marissa will meet her residency obligations if she accompanies Domingo to Uruguay. And finally, we have D. Marissa has already met her residency requirements, so there aren't any potential issues with her plan to go to Uruguay as long as she is in Canada by October 2018. All right, so I know it's a really big question. We're being really tough on you today. It took about 3 minutes just to actually read the question here. But press pause on the video and try to compare this scenario over here to the lesson that we did, and you will get the correct answer. All right, so if you press pause right now, we'll wait for you. So let's begin with D. Now, D says that Marissa has already met her residency requirements, so there aren't any potential issues with her plan to go to Uruguay as long as she is in Canada by October 2018. All right, so this answer is a little bit tough, and we're going to have to really split this up in order to see if it is the correct answer or an incorrect answer. When we go back to that scenario and we take a look at her timeline and we start thinking about Marissa's timeline for being in Canada and what counts towards her residency requirements, we can see again that she was a permanent resident who was in Canada from October 30th, 2013 to March 23rd, 2014. Now, when we begin our timeline, which you're going to start doing in your head all the time, especially after this question, now we can get a general sense over here of the 5 years. So the first 5-year period. All right, so we know that in order to answer this question properly, we're going to have to take a look at October 30th, 2013, all the way through to October 30th, 2018, and hopefully she has 5 years of residency, 2 years of residency during those 5 years. All right, so we know that October 30th, 2013 to March 23rd, 2014. You're not going to do this in the exam, of course. You're not going to count the exact days because you don't have time to do that. But we can take a look and say, hey, it's about 5 months. Now, when we dig a bit deeper into that story of Marissa, and we take a look at her second time in Canada, and we can see that she was there from December 2014 to July 2015. Now, during this time, there were some interesting developments in her life. So she went to the Congo for 3 months, and she also married another permanent resident of Canada. Now, this brings up a really big question that we need to answer, and that is looking at whether or not the time that she spent in the Congo counts towards her residency requirements. All right, so when we dig into Marissa's story again, we can see that she was sent to the Congo. Now remember, with people who are permanent residents, everyone needs to meet the residency requirement, of course. But remember, there are a few little exceptions to being in Canada. And what we're going to do with Marissa's story here is explore if she meets one of those exceptions under Article 28. So remember, with Article 28, a person can be outside of Canada and still have that time count towards the residency requirements if they are employed on a full-time basis. Now, when we look at her story, we can see that she was working at the Saskatoon General Hospital for roughly 6 months, from December 2014 to July 2015. And they give us the information that she was sent to the Congo for 3 months. Now, we have to take a look and, of course, see what she was doing over there and why she was sent there as well, and from whom she was sent there. That's when we get back into the whole notion of the organizational requirements, so the requirements that the company or organization has to meet, and of course the employment requirements that the person has to meet as well. Now, we can assume that she was employed on a full-time basis, and the part that really meets the requirements there under Article 28 is at the bottom here. So she's obviously in the public service of a public institution in Canada. So with this one here, we can assume that the time in there, spent in the Congo working, goes towards her residency requirements. And now when we go back to Maritza's timeline, we have an easier time over here. So now we can see that she has 4.8 months from the first time she was in Canada, and she has 7 months in Canada because of her nursing work that she did overseas. So she was in Canada working and was sent overseas, and the time she spent overseas counts towards her residency. All right, so now we have another piece of the story that we're going to have to look at. So we can see that she married Domingo, and Domingo is a permanent resident from Uruguay. Now we have another piece that we need to add into her timeline, because we can see that from July 2015 to December 2015, she went to Uruguay with her husband because the husband needed to run his family's restaurant during that time. So now we have another question, sort of a question within a question within a question, and that is, does her time spent in Uruguay in 2015 count towards the residency requirements? So in this one here, we need to look at another section of Article 28, and that is somebody who is outside of Canada and accompanying a permanent resident, who is, in this case, it'd be the spouse. And of course, that permanent resident has to be employed on a full-time basis by a Canadian company, or in the Federal Public Administration, or in the public service of a province. So when you see something like this and you're wondering if the time counts towards the residency requirements, you need to actually think of three big pieces of the puzzle here. Now, one is the organization that the spouse or common law partner is working for. The other one is the employment requirements. And the final one is the relationship itself. So remember, we need to see each of these elements, and each of these elements has to be met in order for the time to count towards permanent residency requirements. All right, in this case here, we can see that obviously not. They are married, of course, so they meet those relationship requirements. But in terms of the organization requirements and employment requirements, there's no mention of there being any Canadian connection to the family restaurant. So we would assume that there isn't one, and that the time does not count towards her residency requirements. So now we have to take a look at the last little piece of D, and that is that she won't have any issues with her meeting her permanent residency requirements as long as she's in Canada by October 2018. All right, so in order to completely erase D as a potential answer, we need to just take a look at the timeline again. Now, remember, she arrived in Canada October 30th, 2013. So she has until October 30th, 2018 to meet those residency requirements. Now, what this question, or what this potential answer is testing you on, is whether or not you understand that she has to meet the residency requirements for every 5-year period. So we can see that, as we saw before, she was in Canada for almost 5 months the first time, and almost 7 months the second time. Now, in total, she only has just about 1 year that counts towards her residency requirements from October 30th all the way to the end of that 5-year period, which is October 30th, 2018. So remember, her time in Uruguay in 2015 does not count, because while she was the accompanying spouse of a permanent resident, her husband did not meet those work requirements that would be needed in order for the time spent in Uruguay that first time to count towards the permanent residency requirements. Now, remember, if let's say she arrives in Canada in August or September 2018, that's when she would likely face a removal order, or they wouldn't let her in because she would not be able to meet those residency requirements. All right, so I know it took a little while, but we are now left with only 3 other options. We're going to work through those 3 as well. We're going to start with B next. All right, so B says, due to the fact that Marissa is married to a permanent resident, if Domingo meets his residency requirements, Marissa is exempt from this requirement. Now, if we go back to the story, there's some information in there that pertains to this option. So we know that she is married to Domingo, and Domingo is a permanent resident himself. Now, the answer to this one is pretty easy, especially after, of course, the big analysis that we just did of D. Remember that with regard to residency requirements, it's applicable to every single permanent resident. So it doesn't matter if the person is a millionaire who's living in British Columbia, or if the person immigrated under one of the Quebec programs and maybe he is a student who transitioned into permanent residency. Maybe the person is a grandparent who obtained permanent resident status. It doesn't make a difference. Everybody has to meet these residency requirements. So we know that B is not the answer because, of course, being married to a permanent resident does not exempt a person from the requirement of being in Canada or meeting one of those exceptions for 2 out of 5 years. Now, remember, of course, that Canadian citizens do not have residency requirements once they obtain citizenship, of course. Okay, so now we are left with only 2 options, and essentially they are pretty much opposite of each other. All right, so now we're left with 2 options. So we have A and C. So A says that Marissa will not meet her residency requirements if she accompanies Domingo to Uruguay. And C says the exact opposite. C says that Marissa will meet her residency obligations if she accompanies Domingo to Uruguay. All right, so when we go back to the story here, we need to, again, think of the timeline a little bit. So it's now January 1st, 2017. The first question for us to ask ourselves is if there is actually enough time for her to meet her residency requirements, regardless of whether or not the time spent in Uruguay is accepted towards the residency requirements. Now, the answer, of course, is that we're going to have to look at her timeline again. So we saw that she already spent almost 5 months in Canada the first time, about 7 months later on. Remember that when she went to Uruguay in 2015, that time did not count towards her residency requirements. And because it is now January 1st, 2017, she needs about 12 more months towards her residency requirements because we know that she has 7 months plus 5 months. All that we have to do now is just have a general idea. You don't have to count the exact months or the exact days or anything like that. But we know that January 2017 to the end of October 2018 is 22 months. All right, so there is time for her to meet her residency requirements because she only needs 12 more months and she has 22 months to do that within. All right, so with this one here, the question that we really need to know now is whether this time when Domingo goes to Uruguay, if Marissa accompanies him, will this time count towards her residency requirements? So this is exploring one of those little sub-articles of Article 28, and that is, of course, somebody who is accompanying a permanent resident outside of Canada, and that someone, in this case Marissa, of course, must be the spouse of the permanent resident who's outside Canada. Remember that that permanent resident has to meet certain employment requirements, and the company that the permanent resident is working for has to meet certain organization requirements in order for the time, in this case for the spouse, to count towards permanent residency requirements. Okay, so right away we know that she's married to Domingo, so in terms of the relationship requirements, those are satisfied, of course. What we're going to have to explore are the other elements needed in order for the time to count towards her residency requirements. So in order to answer this question, we have to take a look at Domingo's employment and see if it meets those requirements of Article 28. So from the story, we know that Domingo was offered a contract with Eurocan. And we know the location, so they want him to work at their office in Uruguay. And they want him to make sure that if they're shipping things to Canada, it meets the Canadian standards. Now, when we compare this information to the requirements of the employment, we can see that there's a few pieces missing. So there's no mention really of a Canadian connection or of the employment being controlled from Canada. All right, so that is one thing that we're going to have to be a little bit careful of, because remember that the employment has to be controlled from Canada, has to be full-time, there has to be connection to the Canadian business, temporary, and that the person will continue this job in Canada once that temporary assignment is over. So when we take a look at the company itself, we can see that they give us a few little hints here. So it's an import-export company. That doesn't really tell us too much. They give us some ownership information as well. So it's owned by 3 Uruguayans and 2 Canadians. Now, when we compare this information to the requirements of the organization, we have a really big hint that the company does not meet the organizational requirements, and that is because of the ownership of the company. So the 3 Uruguayans and 2 Canadians shows that the Uruguayans own more of the company, or we can assume that they own more of the company. And again, we don't have any information of this company having any ongoing operations in Canada. They say that there's going to be shipments to Canada, but there's no real information about this other than that they'll be shipping something to Canada. Now, with those hints that we get from exploring Domingo's employment opportunity and the organization that wants to employ him, we know that they likely don't meet those requirements needed under Article 28. So even if Domingo takes the job in Uruguay, the time that he spends there will not count towards his residency requirements. And of course, as his spouse, an adjoining spouse, Marissa, the time that she spends in Uruguay with Domingo while he's working in these organizations will not count towards her residency requirements either. So at the end of this big, tricky question, if you got A as the answer right from the start, that really shows you really understood the lesson that you saw before and that you can take this information and put it into the context of an exam. So congratulations to you if you got that answer correct. For most of you, maybe you were choosing between A and C. Well, now you know the trick for this in order to be able to really tackle any question like this if it comes up on your full skills exam. So even if you didn't get the answer correct, next time you see something like this, it'll probably be an easier question actually, and you'll be able to hit a home run with it. All right, everybody, as always, a big thank you for tuning in. This week, the results were released from the previous ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So we're really happy because we've been getting emails and phone calls and thank you cards and all kinds of things this week. We love what we do. We love helping you pass the full skills exam. Now that you've completed your lesson on residency requirements, you're a couple steps closer. So congratulations to you. Thanks for tuning in. And I look forward to talking to you in our next lesson.